The cold was a constant companion. It seeped through the worn soles of her boots and clung to the threadbare wool of her tunic. It lived in the stone floors of the great hall, a permanent chill that even the roaring hearth in the center could not fully banish. Alara knew this cold intimately. It was the cold of hunger, a hollow ache in her belly that never truly went away. It was the cold of loneliness, a frost that had settled over her heart the day she learned she was an orphan, a burden, a nothing. Today, the cold was in the bucket of greasy water beside her. Ice slicked the rim. Her hands were raw, chapped and split from the lye soap, and plunging them back into the frigid water felt like dipping them in acid. She bit her lip to stifle a cry, her breath misting in the air. Around her, the morning bustle of the Blood Moon pack house was in full swing. Warriors laughed as they sharpened blades. Maids bustled with trays of steaming food, and the scent of roasting boar and warm bread was a sweet, sharp torture. She was invisible. A ghost scrubbing filth from the floor, her gray tunic making her blend into the stones. This was her purpose: to be unseen, unheard, and useful only for the most menial of tasks. An omega. Less than the lowest pack member, a stray taken in out of some long-forgotten dreg of pity. Worthless. The word was a brand on her soul, whispered by the other servants, sneered by the pack warriors, and screamed in the silent, dark hours of the night by the voices in her own head. What would it be like to be them? To laugh without fear, to eat until you were full, to feel the warmth of a fire without being shoved away from it. The questions were dangerous, tiny sparks of hope that she had learned to extinguish before they could catch fire and burn her from the inside out. Hope was a luxury she could not afford. A shadow fell over her. Alara flinched, curling into herself automatically. She did not need to look up to know who it was. The scent of expensive rose oil and smug superiority preceded Lyra everywhere she went. "Still scrubbing, little mouse?" Lyra's voice was like honey laced with poison. "You missed a spot." A slippered foot, embroidered with silver thread, nudged a section of the floor that Alara had just finished. It was pristine. Alara said nothing, merely dipping her rag back into the freezing water. Her silence was a defiance Lyra could not stand. With a contemptuous scoff, Lyra's foot swung, not at the floor, but at the bucket. Icy, foul water sloshed over the stones, soaking the hem of Alara's tunic and splashing against her legs. The shock of the cold was so intense it stole her breath. It felt like being stabbed with 1,000 tiny needles. "Clumsy me," Lyra said, her voice devoid of any real apology. Her friends, 2 other high-ranking she-wolves, giggled behind her. "Looks like you'll have to do it all again. Do try to be more thorough this time. The Alpha King is rumored to be traveling the territories. We wouldn't want him to see what a filthy den Alpha Marcus keeps, would we?" The name sent a ripple of awe and fear through the hall. The Alpha King. Kale. A being of myth and legend, ancient and terrifyingly powerful, the supreme leader of all shifter packs. The thought of such a person ever setting foot here was absurd. "He wouldn't be looking at the floors, Lyra," one of her friends simpered. "He'd be looking at you." Lyra preened, tossing her glossy black hair. "Of course he would, but appearances must be maintained." She looked down at Alara, her lip curled in disgust. "And you are a stain on the appearance of this pack. My father should have let you freeze after your worthless parents were exiled." The words hit their mark. A raw, physical pain lanced through Alara's chest, sharper than the cold, deeper than the hunger. She squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white where she gripped the wet rag. She would not cry. She would not give Lyra the satisfaction. She had learned long ago that her tears were a currency her tormentors gladly accepted. She gritted her teeth, the muscles in her jaw aching. Deep inside, beneath the layers of shame and pain, a tiny, stubborn ember of defiance pulsed. You will not break me. The thought was fierce, silent. You will not. Lyra, bored with the lack of reaction, finally swept away, her laughter echoing off the stone walls. Alara stayed hunched on the floor, the cold water seeping into her skin, the memory of the insult burning hot in her mind. Slowly, painfully, she reached for her bucket. She righted it. She began to soak up the spill, her movements stiff and mechanical. Her own alpha, Marcus, strode through the hall a few moments later, his beta trailing in his wake. He was a large, imposing wolf, but his power was built on bluster and intimidation within his own territory. He stepped right over the puddle, his boots splashing dirty water onto her face, not even registering her presence. She was just part of the floor, a fixture of his hall, an object. The cold was a constant companion, but the invisibility was worse. It was a slow erasure of the self. Sometimes she would look at her raw hands and wonder if they were even there at all. She pushed the thought away and continued her work, her entire world reduced to the few feet of cold, hard stone in front of her. She dreamed of a fire she could not feel, a place that did not exist, a place where she was not invisible. The announcement came that afternoon. The sky, which had been a clear, crisp blue, had turned a bruised, ominous gray. A wind had picked up, howling around the eaves of the pack house with a voice that sounded like a hungry predator. The elders called it a wraith wind, an unnatural storm that presaged dark times. For the pack, it meant the Great Hunt, a brutal tradition to prove their strength against the fury of nature. For Alara, it meant something far worse. Omegas were assigned the most dangerous tasks, the ones no one else wanted. They were the disposable ones. You, a grizzled warrior barked, not even bothering to use her name. The boundary wards on the northern ridge are flickering. The storm is interfering with them. Go, reinforce them. It was a death sentence. The northern ridge was treacherous even in good weather. In a blizzard like the one brewing, it was suicide. No one expected her to come back. This was their way of culling the herd, of trimming the fat, of getting rid of a worthless mouth to feed. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the dull ache of her existence. But to refuse was not an option. Refusal meant a swift, public death. The ridge offered at least a sliver of a chance. A lie she told herself as she was shoved towards the door with a thin cloak and a small satchel of warding stones. The moment she stepped outside, the wind sliced into her like claws. It tore the breath from her lungs and plastered her thin tunic to her skin. Snow, hard and sharp as sand, blasted her face. Within seconds, the pack house was swallowed by the swirling white chaos. She was utterly alone. She trudged onward, her head bowed against the gale. The cold was a living thing, a monster with icy teeth that gnawed at her flesh. Her feet and hands quickly went numb, clumsy blocks of ice that barely obeyed her commands. The world dissolved into a disorienting vortex of white snow and black wind. Was she even going in the right direction? She could no longer tell. Her body was failing. A strange warmth began to spread through her limbs, a dangerous siren song luring her to sleep. She knew what it meant. Her body was starting to shut down, to surrender to the cold. She stumbled, her knees buckling. This is it, she thought. a strange sense of calm washing over the terror. This is the end. At least it will be quiet. She took another step, her foot finding nothing but air. The ground disappeared beneath her. She let out a small, startled cry as she tumbled downward, not falling far, but rolling down a steep, snowy embankment. She landed in a heap at the bottom, the impact jarring the last of the air from her lungs. For a long moment, she just lay there, buried in a deep drift of soft powder. The wind was gone. Down here, in what seemed to be a narrow, sheltered ravine, the storm was a muffled roar far above. It was strangely peaceful. She could just close her eyes, just sleep. But a sound cut through the silence, a low, pained growl. It was not the sound of the wind. It was animal. It was close. Alara's survival instinct, buried but not dead, flared to life. She pushed herself up, her numb hands clumsy. Her eyes scanned the small, protected space, and then she saw it. It was a wolf. But it was like no wolf she had ever seen. It was enormous, a beast of nightmare and legend, its fur the color of midnight and shadow. It was easily twice the size of Alpha Marcus in his shifted form. But it was not its size that held her frozen. It was its predicament. A massive pine tree, ancient and heavy, had fallen, pinning the creature's hindquarters to the frozen ground. Worse, the trunk of the tree was unnaturally dark, laced with veins of something that glinted with a sickly, pale light even in the dim ravine. Silver. The poison of their kind. The great wolf was dying. Its breath came in ragged, steaming pants. Its massive head was low, and its eyes, when they lifted to meet hers, were not the yellow of a normal wolf. They were a deep, intelligent amber, dimmed with agony. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to climb back out of the ravine and take her chances with the storm. This was a predator, a monster. But as she looked into its eyes, she did not see a monster. She saw pain. She saw a proud, powerful being brought low, trapped and suffering. It was a reflection of her own life, in a way. Trapped, suffering. Her fear warred with a deeper, more fundamental part of her. A well of kindness she thought her life had long since dried up. She took a hesitant step forward. The wolf let out another growl, a warning rumble, but it was weak, laced with a whine of pure misery. I won't hurt you, she whispered, her voice hoarse and thin. The words were absurd. What could she possibly do to a creature like this? She circled it cautiously. The silver-laced wood was visibly burning its flesh. The scent of seared fur and blood mingled with the clean smell of pine and winter. He was shivering, the powerful muscles trembling not just from the cold, but from the silver's venom. He was going to die. Here, alone, in the cold. Just like her. The thought resonated with a painful clarity. She could not leave him. She could not stand by and watch another living thing die alone. She looked around desperately. Her hands were too numb to be of any use. She found a sharp-edged piece of granite and tried to use it as a wedge to lever the heavy trunk. It was useless. The tree didn't budge. The effort sent a fresh wave of agony through the wolf, and its head thudded back into the snow with a sound of defeat. His amber eyes were starting to glaze over. He was fading. The cold was taking him, just as it had almost taken her. A desperate, insane idea sparked in her mind. Warmth. He needed warmth. She was freezing herself, but she was still alive. Her meager body heat was the only thing she had to offer. Throwing aside the last vestiges of fear and reason, she moved to his side, avoiding the massive, still-breathing jaws. She hesitated for only a second, then lay down in the snow beside the vast, shuddering body. She pressed herself against his flank, pulling her thin cloak over them both. It was like huddling next to a mountain of trembling ice. She reached out a numb hand, resting it on the thick, midnight fur of his shoulder, trying to will her own fading life force into him. "It's okay," she murmured, her words lost in his fur. "You're not alone." The moment her skin touched his fur, the world exploded. It was not a sound, it was a feeling. A jolt of pure, raw energy, white-hot and blinding, slammed through her body. It started in her palm and detonated in her chest, a silent thunderclap that seemed to crack her soul open. It was not pain. It was too vast, too overwhelming for a simple word like pain. It was everything. A light, brilliant as the heart of a star, erupted from her hand. It pulsed outward, a wave of impossible warmth and power. The snow around them vaporized instantly, hissing into steam. The air in the ravine grew warm, then hot, shimmering with a light that had no source but her. An agony unlike any other, sharp and searing, erupted on the back of her hand. She cried out, pulling it back instinctively. There, burned into her pale skin, was a mark. It glowed with a soft, silver light, a complex, elegant symbol that looked like a snarling wolf's head intertwined with a crescent moon. It was beautiful and terrifying. She stared at it, her mind reeling. What was happening? What was this? A deep, resonant groan drew her attention back to the wolf. The change in him was staggering. The sickly pallor of the silver poisoning was gone. The raw, burned flesh where the tree had pinned him was already starting to heal. New skin and fur knitting together before her eyes. He was no longer shivering. A powerful heat was rolling off his body now, a furnace of pure life. With a surge of unimaginable strength, he rose. The massive, silver-laced pine tree didn't just lift, it splintered, cracking and shattering into pieces as if it were a dry twig. The beast stood, free and whole, shaking the snow and wood fragments from its midnight fur. He turned to face her. The change in his eyes stole the air from her lungs. The dim, pain-filled amber was gone. Now they were the color of molten gold, blazing with an ancient, predatory intelligence and a power that made the world itself seem to tremble. He was no longer just a wolf. He was something more, something primal and terrifying. He stalked towards her, each step silent and deliberate. She scrambled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her back hit the cold stone wall of the ravine. There was nowhere left to run. He loomed over her, a mountain of shadow and power. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the teeth, for the end. But it didn't come. Instead, a strange heat washed over her. She dared to open her eyes. The wolf was gone. In his place stood a man. He was immense, broad-shouldered and impossibly tall, filling the small space with his presence. He was naked, his skin bronzed and covered in faint scars that told tales of 1,000 battles. His face was harsh and predatorily beautiful, all sharp angles and uncompromising strength, framed by a mane of wild black hair that fell to his shoulders. And his eyes. They were the same molten gold, glowing with an intensity that pinned her in place, that saw right through her, into the battered, hidden corners of her soul. He moved with a fluid grace that was utterly inhuman. He knelt before her, his movements slow, deliberate, as if not to startle a fawn. He gently took her hand, the one with the glowing mark. His touch was surprisingly warm, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. The contact sent another, softer jolt through her, a hum of rightness, of belonging that terrified her more than anything else. He lifted her hand, his golden eyes fixed on the new, shining brand on her skin. A low sound rumbled in his chest, a sound of profound, soul-deep satisfaction. His voice, when he spoke, was a quiet thunder, a deep bass that vibrated through her bones. Mine. The word was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a claim, a declaration that shook the foundations of her world. Confusion and terror warred within her. This was impossible. A dream. A hallucination brought on by the cold. She tried to pull her hand away, a pathetic, feeble gesture. He did not tighten his grip, yet she could not move. It was like trying to fight the tide. His other hand came up, his fingers brushing a strand of damp hair from her cheek. His touch was impossibly gentle, a caress from a god of destruction. His gaze held hers, possessive and absolute. I have you, he rumbled, his voice softening but losing none of its power. It was too much. The cold, the fear, the impossible power that had surged through her, the glowing mark, this terrifying, beautiful man who looked at her as if he had been searching for her for 1,000 years. Her vision swam. The golden eyes were the last thing she saw before the world tilted and dissolved into blackness. She awoke to warmth. It was the first thing she registered, a deep, penetrating warmth that chased the perpetual chill from her bones. She was lying on a bed of soft furs, and a thick, heavy cloak that smelled of pine, winter storms, and something uniquely male was draped over her. A small, crackling fire danced in the center of what appeared to be a dry, sheltered cave. She sat up, her head throbbing. The man was there, Cale. He sat across the fire, watching her. He had pulled on a simple pair of leather trousers, but his chest was still bare, the firelight playing over the hard planes of his muscles. His intensity had not lessened. He watched her as if she were the only thing in the universe, his golden eyes tracking her every small movement. You are safe, he said. His voice was still a low rumble, but it held a new note of tenderness. Safe? She had never been less safe in her life. She clutched the heavy cloak around her, a flimsy shield against his overwhelming presence. On the back of her hand, the mark was no longer glowing, but it remained, a permanent, silvery scar against her skin, a brand. What are you? She whispered, her voice trembling. I am Cale, he said, as if that explained everything. And you are her. Her? The confusion was a thick fog in her mind. I don't understand. He rose and crossed the small cave in 2 silent strides. He knelt before her again, his sheer size blotting out the firelight. He was being gentle, she knew, but his power was a palpable force, pressing in on her from all sides. The bond. It is chosen, after all these centuries. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the mark on her hand. It is a soul bond, the mark of the fated mate, my mate. Mate. Queen. The words were madness. She shook her head, pulling back. No, you're mistaken. I'm no one. I'm an omega, worthless. The words slipped out, a bitter truth she had lived with her entire life. A dangerous light flared in his golden eyes. A low growl vibrated in his chest, so powerful she felt it in her teeth. Never say that word, he commanded, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. They made you believe that. They were wrong. You are the sun that thaws the ice, the fire in the heart of winter. You saved me. Your light. It burned away the silver. He looked at her not with pity, but with a fierce, burning reverence that terrified her. He saw something in her that she knew wasn't there. A queen? A mate to this king? It was a cruel joke, a dream from which she would wake up back on the cold stone floors. Before he could say more, a faint sound echoed from outside the cave, cutting through the howl of the wind. Horns. Voices. Her pack. They were searching. Kale's head snapped up, a predatory stillness falling over him. A growl, low and guttural, escaped his lips. He looked from the cave mouth back to her, his jaw tight with frustration. "They cannot find me here," he said, his voice hard. "Not yet. To reveal myself on another alpha's land without a formal challenge is to invite war." He looked into her eyes, and the raw possession was back, tenfold. "They will not keep you from me. I will come for you, Alara." He knew her name. How could he know her name? "Stay hidden until I do," he commanded. "Do not let them see the mark." And then, with a speed that defied her eyes, he was gone. He didn't run. He simply melted into the shadows at the back of the cave and vanished. One moment he was there, a towering, solid presence, and the next, only the scent of pine and storm remained. The shouts were closer now. "Over here! I found tracks!" Panic seized her. She quickly pulled the sleeve of her tunic down over the mark. Moments later, 2 of her pack's warriors appeared at the mouth of the cave. Their expressions were grim. They had been sent to retrieve a body, not a living girl. "She's alive," one said, his voice flat with surprise. They grabbed her, their grips rough and impatient, and dragged her from the warmth of the cave back into the biting wind. The journey back was a blur of misery and confusion. Her mind was a maelstrom. Kale, the mark, the light, mate, queen. It all swirled together, a fantasy at odds with the brutal reality of the warrior's fingers digging into her arm. They threw her at the feet of Alpha Marcus in the great hall. He looked down at her, his expression one of annoyance that she had survived and complicated things. "You were told to reinforce the wards, not hide in a cave," he snarled. "I fell," she mumbled, her eyes on the floor. As she pushed herself up, her sleeve slid back, just for a second, but it was enough. The firelight caught the intricate silvery lines of the mark on her hand. Marcus froze. His eyes, which had been dismissive, narrowed into sharp, calculating points. He lunged forward, grabbing her arm with a painful grip. He yanked her hand up, turning it over, his gaze locked on the symbol. He didn't know what it was, she could see that in his eyes, but he recognized its nature. He recognized the sheer power humming beneath the skin. A claiming mark. A brand of ownership from someone, or something, immensely powerful. A slow, greedy smile spread across his face. He was no longer looking at Alara, the worthless Omega. He was looking at a prize, a tool, a conduit to a power he could only dream of. "Well, well," he breathed, his voice thick with avarice. "What have we here?" He did not care who had marked her. He only cared that she was marked. In his primitive, brutal view of the world, possession was everything. If he could control her, perhaps he could control the power she was now tied to. "She is not yours to claim," he declared to the gathered pack members, his voice booming with false authority. "She is of this pack. Her fate is bound to me, to us." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. This was worse than being invisible. Now she was seen. But she was seen as a thing, a key. He dragged her away from the great hall, his fingers digging into her arm like talons. He pulled her down a flight of stone stairs into the damp, musty cellar beneath the pack house where the most sacred and most brutal rituals were performed. A large, flat stone altar dominated the center of the room, carved with ancient, faded runes. "You are a daughter of the Blood Moon Pack," Marcus grunted, shoving her towards the altar. "You belong to me. No outsider, no wandering spirit can put their brand on what is mine." He intended to break the bond, to overwrite Kale's mark with his own crude pack sigil. The arrogance of it was staggering. He was a candle, trying to outshine the sun. "Hold her," he commanded two of his guards. They seized her arms, forcing her onto her knees before the stone. The cold of it seeped through her tunic, a chilling premonition of violation. Marcus began to chant, a low, guttural language. He drew a ritual knife, its edge obsidian sharp. He was not going to carve his mark over Kale's. He was going to cut Kale's mark from her flesh. The thought sent a wave of nausea and terror through her. No! The thought was a silent scream in her mind. He raised the knife. His other hand reached out, his thick fingers closing around her wrist, his thumb pressing down hard on the silver mark. The moment his skin made contact with the soul bond, it reacted. The mark erupted, not with the warm, healing light from the ravine, but with a violent, defensive blast of pure white force. It was a silent explosion, a concussive wave of energy that had nothing to do with Alara's conscious will. It was the bond itself, rejecting the violation. The force slammed into Marcus, throwing him backward as if he were a child's toy. He flew across the room and crashed into the far stone wall with a sickening crunch, slumping to the ground, unconscious. The two guards holding her were blasted back as well, crying out as they hit the floor. An ungodly pain shot up Alara's arm, a fiery agony that felt like her soul was being torn in two. It was the echo of Marcus's attempt to sever the bond. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that somewhere in the vast, storm-tossed wilderness, Kale had just felt it too. Before she could even process what had happened, before the last echoes of the energy blast faded, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to coalesce. They moved. Figures emerged from the darkness, silent and swift. They were not of her pack. They were dressed in black leather armor that seemed to absorb the light, their faces obscured by cowls. Their movements were too fast, too fluid, their eyes glowing with a malevolent red light. The scent of ozone and rot filled the air. They moved with chilling efficiency. One of the figures kicked the ritual knife away. Two more subdued the groaning, dazed guards with brutal, precise blows. They were warriors of a different caliber entirely. Dark shifters. One of them, taller than the rest, approached her. She scrambled backward, but her legs were weak and trembling. He reached for her. She flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, he grabbed her arm and snapped a heavy manacle around her wrist. It was made of silver. The moment the cold metal closed around her skin, a new kind of agony ripped through her. It was a hollowing, draining pain. The faint humming connection to Kale, the thread of gold that had been a constant presence in the back of her mind since the cave, was choked off, dampened. The world seemed to fade to gray, the warmth leaching out of it. The pain of the separation was a physical wound, a gaping hole torn in her chest. She cried out, a thin, desperate sound. The cowled figure ignored her, hauling her to her feet. They were not here for Marcus. They were here for her. They had been waiting, watching, and the bond's defensive blast had been the signal they were waiting for. They dragged her from the cellar, up through the now chaotic pack house. Her pack was in disarray, confused by the blast from below. The dark shifters moved through them like wraiths, a whirlwind of black leather and red eyes, and no one could stop them. They were out of the pack house and into the raging blizzard in moments. The last thing she saw of her home was Lyra's face, pale with shock and a hint of satisfaction, watching from an upstairs window as Alara was hauled away into the storm, a prisoner. She was thrown into the back of a crude-covered wagon, the door bolted shut behind her. The silver manacles on her wrists and ankles seemed to leech the very life from her, leaving her weak and shivering with more than just the cold. The bond, her fragile connection to KL, was a faint, agonizingly distant pulse. It was like trying to breathe through a thick, wet cloth. The journey was an eternity of darkness, jolting movement and despair. Where were they taking her? Who were they? Her brief, impossible dream of being found, of being seen, had turned into a nightmare. She was a pawn again, a thing to be used, stolen from one master only to be given to another. The old, familiar feeling of worthlessness washed over her, heavier and more crushing than ever before. She had been given a glimpse of the sun, only to be plunged into a deeper, colder darkness. The wagon finally shuddered to a halt. The door was unbolted, and harsh torchlight flooded the small space. She was dragged out into a courtyard of black volcanic stone. Before her loomed a grim, jagged fortress, a spike of malice driven into the heart of a desolate, snow-covered mountain range. The very air here felt wrong, tainted with dark magic. She was pulled through massive iron gates, down cold, echoing hallways, and finally thrown into a cell. The door, a solid slab of iron, boomed shut, the sound of the bolt sliding home sealing her fate. The cell was small, bare, and freezing. A single high slit of a window showed only a sliver of the gray, angry sky. The silver chains were still on her, tethering her to the wall. The ache of the severed bond was a constant, gnawing agony in her soul. It was a hollow space where Kale's presence had been, a phantom limb that would not stop hurting. Hope died. Despair was a cold, heavy shroud. She curled into a ball on the filthy stone floor, the tears she had refused to shed for Lyra now freezing on her cheeks. She was alone. Truly, utterly alone. Hours, or perhaps days, passed in that cold, dark misery. Time had lost its meaning. There was only the cold, the pain, and the crushing weight of her own insignificance. Then, the cell door opened. He stood there, framed by the light from the corridor. He was tall and strikingly handsome, with silver hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes the color of a winter sky. He was dressed in immaculate black armor, and he moved with a serpent's grace. He radiated a charisma that was as captivating as it was deeply unsettling. He was the calm at the center of a storm of darkness. "So," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, a stark contrast to the brutality of his fortress. "You are the one who has caused so much trouble." He entered the cell, the door closing behind him. He circled her slowly, like a wolf inspecting a trapped rabbit. His gaze was analytical, cold. "I am Vorlag," he announced, "and you are my guest." "Let me go," she whispered, the words barely audible. A faint, cruel smile touched his lips. "I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, I have been searching for you for a very long time, or rather, for what you are." He crouched down in front of her, his chillingly calm eyes boring into hers. "The prophecies call you the sun-touched, a being born with the spark of creation, the power to heal the world, or to burn it to ash. A power that has been dormant in your bloodline for generations, waiting for the right catalyst to awaken it. He gestured to her hand, still bare where the sleeve had been torn. The silvery mark stood out against her pale skin. And it seems you have found your catalyst. The old king, Kale. A foolish, sentimental relic, clinging to his antiquated notions of fated mates and soul bonds. Vorlag stood, pacing the small cell. He believes that bond makes you his. He is wrong. It only makes you a key, a weapon, a power source, and that power belongs to a new age. My age. His plan, which he laid out with chilling clarity, was one of pure, nihilistic ambition. He led the Ember Covenant, a faction of shifters who embraced the dark, chaotic magic their ancestors had forbidden. He believed the world was weak, stagnant under Kale's rule. He wanted to shatter the old order, to use Alara's nascent power as a lens to focus his own dark magic, and to remake the world in his own image of fire and shadow. I will sever your pathetic bond to that fossil, Vorlag said, his voice dropping. And then I will bind you to me. Your light will fuel my darkness. Together, we will be gods. To prove his point, he waved a hand. The air in the cell shimmered, and an image appeared in the swirling pool of shadow on the floor. It was a scrying pool. In it, she saw a forest, trees torn apart, the ground gouged as if by a titan. And in the center of the devastation was Kale. He was in his human form, his face a mask of incandescent rage and agony. He let out a roar, not of a man, but of a wounded god, a sound of pure primal fury that she felt as a faint, painful echo even through the silver's dampening effect. He was tearing the world apart, searching for her. You see? Vorlag murmured, a note of satisfaction in his voice. The separation weakens him. It drives him mad. By the time he finds this place, he will be a mindless beast, and I will put him down like one. Seeing Kale in such pain, a pain she was causing, a pain he felt because of her, was the final blow. A wave of utter despair washed over her. So profound it was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. It was all her fault. She was a curse, a plague. Everyone who came near her was destroyed. Her parents, exiled. Kale, driven mad with grief. Vorlag was right. She was just a tool for destruction. The scrying pool faded. Vorlag gave her one last, triumphant look and left, the bolt of the door sliding home with a sound of finality. She was broken. The last ember of her defiance was gone, smothered by the icy tide of despair. She lay on the stone, wishing for the end, wishing for the cold of the blizzard to return and finally claim her. In that abyss of hopelessness, with nothing left to lose, she did the only thing she could. She reached out. Not with her hands, but with her mind, with the tattered remnants of her soul. She focused on the faint, agonizing ache where the bond used to be, and she poured all of her pain, all of her fear, all of her despair into it. Kale. The air was thick with the stench of burning herbs and corrupt magic. In the center of the chamber was a circular altar of polished obsidian, inscribed with a complex web of glowing crimson runes. They chained her to it, her arms and legs spread-eagled. The cold of the stone was absolute, a dead cold that seemed to draw the very life from her. Vorlag stood before her, dressed in ceremonial robes of black and silver. He held a staff topped with a jagged, black crystal that pulsed with a malevolent light. "Do not fight this, little son," he said, his voice almost gentle. "The pain will be immense, but it will be brief. When it is over, you will be reborn. You will be part of something greater." He began the incantation. The crimson runes on the altar flared, their light hot and painful. The silver manacles on her wrists and ankles began to glow, and the pain intensified 100-fold. It felt as if hooks were being driven into her soul, preparing to tear it apart. The fragile connection to Kale flickered violently, threatening to extinguish completely. She screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony. Vorlag's chanting grew louder, the crystal on his staff blazing. He was gathering the power, preparing for the final strike that would shatter the soul bond forever. And then, a new sound intruded. It began as a low vibration that shook the stone beneath her. It grew into a deep, guttural howl that seemed to come from the very bedrock of the mountain. It was a sound of absolute, unrestrained fury, a sound of millennia of loneliness transformed into righteous rage. It was the howl of a king who had come to reclaim his queen. Vorlag faltered, his eyes widening in disbelief. The howl was answered by a chorus from outside, the war cries of hundreds of powerful wolves. Suddenly, the far wall of the chamber exploded inward. Not a door, not a gate. The solid, 10-foot-thick stone wall itself disintegrated into a storm of rock and dust. His silver eyes were locked on one target, Vorlag. The Shadow King recovered his composure, his face twisting into a snarl of fury. "You are too late, old man," he screamed, raising his staff. He unleashed a bolt of pure dark energy, a coiling serpent of black and purple magic, straight at Kale. The blast struck Kale in the shoulder. He roared in pain, stumbling for a second, the dark magic smoking and sizzling on his fur, eating away at his flesh. He was wounded. Seeing him hurt, seeing this magnificent, powerful being injured for her sake, shattered the last of Alara's despair. It shattered the fear. It shattered the girl who believed she was worthless. Something new rose in its place. Rage. A pure, white-hot, righteous fury. Rage at Lyra. Rage at Marcus. Rage at Vorlag. Rage at a world that had tried to crush her, to use her, to erase her. Rage for the one person who had looked at her and seen not an Omega, not a tool, but a queen. A power that had nothing to do with Kale or the bond. A power that was hers, and hers alone answered that rage. It detonated. It was not a small flicker of light like in the ravine. It was a supernova. A silent, blinding explosion of pure, golden light erupted from her body. The light was the heart of the sun. It was the fire of creation. It was life itself made manifest. The silver chains on her wrists and ankles didn't just break. They vaporized. The obsidian altar cracked and split beneath her. The wave of golden energy washed over the entire chamber. It didn't harm Kale's warriors, but it was annihilation for the Ember Covenant. The dark shifters shrieked as the light touched them, their corrupt forms dissolving into ash and smoke. The dark magic infesting the fortress was scoured away, leaving behind only clean, cold stone. The light washed over Kale. His wound, the one dealt by Vorlag's staff, healed instantly. The dark magic burned away, leaving behind whole, healthy flesh. Alara rose from the fractured altar. She was no longer chained. She was no longer weak. Her simple, ragged tunic seemed to shimmer, and her eyes, once the color of a timid forest floor, were now glowing with the same molten gold as Kale's, but brighter, fiercer. The power thrummed through her, an orchestra of life and fire. She turned her gaze to Vorlag. He was the only one of his followers left standing, though the light had shattered his staff and thrown him against the far wall. He stared at her, his charismatic facade gone, replaced by raw, primal terror. He was not looking at a stolen Omega. He was looking at a goddess. She took a step forward, her bare feet silent on the stone. Her voice, when she spoke, did not belong to the frightened girl from the pack house. It was calm, clear, and carried the weight of a star. It was the voice of a queen. "You called me a tool," she said, each word a judgment. "You called me worthless. You tried to break me, to steal what was mine." She raised a hand, her palm glowing with incandescent light. "You are the one who is nothing." A beam of concentrated sunlight, pure and blinding, shot from her palm. It struck Vorlag in the chest. He screamed, but not in pain of death. The light was not killing him. It was cleansing him. It was burning the darkness, the ambition, the corruption, the forbidden magic from his very soul. When the light faded, he collapsed to the floor, no longer a shadow king, just a man, powerless, broken, empty. The battle was over. The chamber was silent, save for the ragged breathing of the warriors and the faint crackle of residual energy in the air. Kale, his silver eyes wide with awe, love, and a reverence that shook her to her core, shifted. The transformation was fluid, the massive wolf collapsing into the form of the man who stood tall and whole amidst the devastation. He did not swagger. He did not roar in victory. He walked towards her, his steps slow, his golden gaze fixed on her. He did not approach her as a king claiming a prize he had won. He approached her as a man meeting his equal, his other half, for the very first time. "Alara," he breathed. Her name, spoken with a wonder that made her heart ache. The immense power that had flooded her veins receded, leaving her bones feeling like water. Her legs gave out. She collapsed, not into darkness, but into his arms. He caught her, holding her tight against his warm, solid chest. His strength was an anchor in the swirling chaos of what had just happened. "You came for me," she whispered into his shoulder, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Always," he rumbled, his voice thick with emotion. He held her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe, his hand stroking her hair. "Always." They stood there for a long time, simply holding each other, a quiet island in the wreckage of Vorlag's ambition. Finally, he gently pulled back, though he kept his hands on her arms, steadying her. He looked down at the silvery mark on her hand, the symbol of their bond. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the mark, a gesture of profound devotion. As he did, the mark on her skin flared with a brilliant, warm light. A gasp escaped her as a corresponding warmth spread over his heart. He pulled back the tattered remnants of his shirt. There, burned over his heart, was a matching mark, a wolf and a moon, glowing with a fierce golden light that mirrored the power in her eyes. The bond was no longer just his claim on her. It was complete. It was a circle, a bond of equals. She had claimed him just as he had claimed her. Weeks later, the memory of the Black Fortress was a fading nightmare. She stood on a wide balcony carved from the side of a mountain, looking out over Kale's kingdom. It was a breathtaking vista of sun-drenched valleys, deep green forests, and snow-capped peaks that pierced a sky of impossible blue. The air was clean and alive, thrumming with the vitality of his people, his pack. She was dressed not in rags, but in a simple, elegant gown the color of twilight. Kale stood beside her, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. His presence was a constant, reassuring warmth. Below them, in a vast natural amphitheater, were gathered thousands upon thousands of shifters, the people of his kingdom, his family. He stepped forward, his voice needing no magical amplification to carry across the enormous space. "People of the Silver Throne! For centuries, our kingdom has been strong, but it has been incomplete. I have been incomplete." His golden eyes found hers, and the love in them was so powerful it was a physical force. "Today, that changes. I present to you not a prize I have won, but the heart that was missing from my chest. I present to you the fire that has brought back the sun." He held out a hand to her. "I present to you Alara, the sun-touched, your queen." She took his hand and stepped forward to stand beside him, not behind him. A great roar of approval rose from the crowd, a sound of joy and acceptance that washed over her, healing the last of the old wounds. She looked out at the sea of faces, and in their eyes, she did not see pity or scorn or greed. She saw respect. She saw reverence. She saw family. She was no longer the worthless Omega from a forgotten pack. She was not a tool. She was not a ghost. She was Alara. She was a savior. She was loved. She turned to Kale, her hand tightening in his. She looked into the molten gold eyes that had seen her when she was invisible to the rest of the world and to herself. She was a queen, and she was, at long last, home.